The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like 1,000 insects trapped in glass. Norfolk Train Station's medical clinic occupied the corner space beside Platform 7, a 6x12 room with examination tables, a locked supply cabinet, and the persistent smell of antiseptic layered over the station's baseline aroma of diesel exhaust and stale coffee. Natalie Hayes stood at the sink, water running warm across her hands, and she did not think about the last time she'd scrubbed in before surgery. She did not think about the sound of incoming fire or the weight of a scalpel in her palm at 3 in the morning in a place that officially did not exist. She dried her hands on a paper towel and moved to the examination table, wiping it down with deliberate, methodical strokes. Bleach and water. The smell of ordinary work. 3 years. That was how long she had been invisible here. 3 years of motion sickness cases and twisted ankles, and a businessman last Tuesday who'd swallowed a peanut and thought his throat was closing. She had talked him through it. Breathing exercises. Calm voice. The peanut dissolved. He left a $2 tip and never looked at her name badge. Most people didn't. They saw a woman in blue scrubs with brown hair tied back, competent enough to handle their minor crises, forgettable enough to stop thinking about the moment they stepped out the clinic door. This was the arrangement she had made with herself the day she arrived at Norfolk. Quiet. Helpful. No history. No questions. The 313 to Washington announced itself over the station's public address system, the metallic voice crackling through speakers mounted near the ceiling. Natalie's shoulders did not tense. Her breathing did not change. But her right hand, the one holding the bleach-dampened cloth, paused for exactly 1 second before resuming its circular motion across the stainless steel surface. The muscle memory was deep. Announcement systems. Mobilization. The sound of departure. She had learned long ago to isolate responses to their smallest possible expressions. A pause. A breath. Nothing that would register on the faces of observers. Nothing that would matter. She folded the cloth and hung it on the rack beside the sink, the fabric still damp, the folds precise. Her jacket hung on a hook beside her locker, a navy pullover, the kind that would not stand out in any crowd. Inside the lining, sewn into a seam at the left shoulder with dark blue thread that matched the fabric exactly, was a patch. Faded. Smaller than a playing card. The emblem of the 5th Special Forces Group, the words around its border barely legible anymore. 23 years ago, someone had given her that patch during a ceremony she was not allowed to tell anyone about, in a room with 16 other people, all of them now scattered across the world or dead or, like her, pretending to be ordinary. She did not reach for the jacket. Not now. But she felt it there the way a person feels a scar beneath their shirt. Present. Evidence. The only proof of who she had been. The clinic door opened. Gerald Caldwell appeared in the frame, his presence carrying the kind of authority that comes from a clipboard and a title. Station manager. The nameplate on his office door said so. The polo shirt, Coast Guard Auxiliary, navy blue with an embroidered anchor, suggested something deeper, though Natalie had learned to be skeptical of such suggestions. The man had the build of someone who talked more than he worked, the kind of posture that came from sitting behind desks and making decisions that affected people he never had to look in the eye. He was 48, maybe 50. The kind of handsome that requires other people to agree it is handsome. She did not agree, but then, he was not asking her opinion. Hayes, he said, not looking at her directly, which was typical. He looked at the examination table. The supply cabinet. The small waste paper basket beneath the sink. He looked at her workspace rather than at her. I need your supply inventory by end of shift. Count everything. Gauze, syringes, bandages, the lot. We're running audits on all departments this quarter. Budget is tightening. Wastage is a liability. He paused. His eyes did flick toward her for a moment. And tried to smile more. Customer service matters. People come in here stressed. A little warmth goes a long way. You're always so. He waved his hand as if searching for a word that was not quite insult, not quite concern. Neutral. Natalie inclined her head. A small gesture. Acknowledgement. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She did not say that she had cared for a Marine with third-degree burns over 70% of his body, that she had held his hand while his screaming stopped because the damage had finally reached the point where screaming was not possible anymore, that she had looked him in the eye and told him he would be okay even though they both knew that was a lie. She did not say that smiling at a man with a sprained wrist felt like using a language that had burned out of her throat years ago. Instead, she turned back to her work. The clipboard would get his inventory. The shells would get her attention. The smile would not materialize because it had nowhere to materialize from. Caldwell lingered for 3 seconds. Just long enough for the silence to become not quite comfortable. Then he left, the door closing behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss. Through the small window in the upper third of the door, Natalie could see him walking back toward the main terminal area, past the benches where travelers sat with their luggage, past the coffee cart, past the digital departure boards that flickered and changed with the constancy of breath. He moved like a man who believed the world around him functioned because of him, not in spite of him. She had met men like that before. They rarely lasted long in places where the stakes were high enough to measure competence against actual results. She returned to the supply cabinet, the metal door opening with a precise click. The inventory sheets were kept in a manila folder on the top shelf, and she pulled them down, along with a ballpoint pen that had been chewed on by someone with very small teeth. The sheets were typed on a dot matrix printer that had probably not worked since 2004. 3 years of handwritten updates in 3 different pens, 3 different handwriting styles as the clinic had cycled through temporary staff. No one stayed. The position paid $8 more than minimum wage and required a nursing license. The mathematics were simple. Natalie stayed because she had no reason to go. She counted 14 boxes of 4x4 gauze pads, 7 boxes of 2x2, 3 boxes of 1x1. Saline bottles, 32 of them. Antibiotic ointment, bandage strips in 4 sizes, splinting material, elastic wraps, examination gloves in latex and nitrile. Isopropyl alcohol for sterilization. A crash cart with a defibrillator that had been tested monthly for 23 months without ever needing to be used. She knew the location of everything, the quantity of everything, the expiration date of everything. Her mind held these facts the way it had once held medical protocols for hypothermia treatment, for tourniquet application, for recognizing the difference between arterial and venous bleeding by the color and pressure of the flow. Old skills. Dormant skills. Skills that had no use pushing a cart through a train station clinic. The businessman from last Tuesday had been named Robert Chen. He had sat on the examination table with his tie loosened, convinced that his throat was swelling, that the peanut he'd eaten from a vending machine 15 minutes ago was lodging somewhere in his esophagus, blocking air passage. She had asked him to breathe through his nose. In for 4 counts. Out for 6. She had watched his oxygen saturation on the pulse oximeter steady at 98%. She had told him that his throat was not swelling, that his airway was patent, that what he was feeling was panic and that panic could be managed. He had believed her. His shoulders had relaxed. His heart rate had dropped from 112 to 84. He had left the clinic 10 minutes later, apologetic, embarrassed, grateful. He had not known that the woman who calmed him down had once performed an emergency cricothyrotomy in a concrete building in Helmand Province with a scalpel that had been autoclaved 17 times and a headlamp that was failing and 18 people watching because they were out of options. Robert Chen was fine. The Marine from Marja, the one whose name she was not supposed to remember, had lived. That was the transaction. Small moments of competence in exchange for a life that was, technically, no longer living. The inventory took 42 minutes. She wrote the numbers in neat, methodical script, 14. 7. 3. 32. The ballpoint pen moved across the paper with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, the same precision that would have marked out dosage calculations, patient observation notes, casualty assessments. All the same skill. Different contexts. She had learned long ago that competence was transferable. You could save a man from septic shock in a field hospital, or you could talk a businessman down from a peanut panic attack. The fundamentals were identical. Presence. Observation. The ability to make a person believe that you knew what you were doing, even if what you were doing was simply existing in the same room as their fear. She did not hear Caldwell return to his office. He moved through the station the way managers do, checking on things, asserting control, the kind of visible authority that came from having titles but not responsibility. But she felt him there the way you feel a storm coming. The pressure change. The shift in air currents. She had learned in places where missing such signals meant death, so the habit had stuck. Caldwell was the kind of man who believed that problems solved themselves if you assigned them to the right subordinate. He was also the kind of man who would be shocked and then vindictive if a subordinate solved something in a way he had not anticipated. She had encountered this type before. They did not last long in actual combat zones, but they thrived in administrative hierarchies. The skills were different, but the belief systems were the same. The afternoon light shifted through the clinic window. The departure board outside flickered. Another announcement came through the speakers, this time for the 412 to Philadelphia. A woman pushed a stroller past the window. Two teenagers, backpacks too full for comfort, arguing in the register of people who had never learned to keep their voices modulated. A wheelchair rolled past, its occupant visible only from the side, a man with prosthetic legs, the socket mechanism visible where his pants ended, insignia on his jacket that made something in her sternum shift almost imperceptibly. Military insignia. Army or maybe Marines. The color was faded. The angle was wrong for her to read it clearly. The wheelchair kept moving. The moment passed. She returned to her inventory sheets. But her right hand had stopped moving. The pen was suspended above the paper. And for a duration of exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register but not long enough to be called a reaction, she held still. Muscle memory was not just physical. It lived in the nervous system, in the cellular memory of response patterns, in the automatic recognition of clan markers even years removed from the context where clan had mattered. She forced air through her nose. For counts. Out for 6. The same rhythm she had taught the man with the peanut. The same rhythm she had taught herself in places where panic was a luxury unavailable to people who were actively responsible for other people's survival. She finished the inventory at 5:28. Caldwell would not review it until morning. She filed the sheets in the manila folder and returned them to the cabinet. She removed her name badge, Natalie Hayes, RN, Clinic 7, and hung it beside her jacket. The patch was still there inside the lining. She could feel it. 23 years of existence inside dark blue thread. The kind of proof that did not show up in personnel databases or background checks, or the kind of cursory reviews that men like Caldwell conducted when they wanted to feel like they were being thorough without actually investing effort into the process. She locked the clinic door at 5:31. The station would run all night, the trains coming and going, the people flowing through the concourse like blood through a system that did not question its own movement. She was part of the infrastructure now. Not seen. Not memorable. Present only in the moments when someone needed something fixed. The next shift person would arrive at 6. She would not. Tomorrow she would return and count supplies and tend to minor ailments and keep her eyes on the space where wheelchairs moved through the terminal. She would not think about the insignia. She would not think about the faded unit patch inside her jacket lining. She would be quiet. She would be helpful. She would be invisible. That was the arrangement. The 3 teenagers clustered near the main terminal benches like predators who'd spotted easy prey. One of them pointed at Marcus Webb in his wheelchair, his prosthetic legs gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The other mimicked an exaggerated limping movement, knees bent at grotesque angles, while a third filmed on his phone. "Check out the robot legs, bro," the first one laughed, his voice carrying across the tile with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been told no. Marcus stared straight ahead, jaw locked. He'd heard worse. The problem wasn't the teenagers, it was that no one stopped them. The afternoon crowd flowed around him like water around a stone. A woman in a charcoal suit rolled her eyes when Marcus asked her for help reaching the ticket kiosk. She stepped over him without breaking stride, her heels clicking against the floor. Two businessmen in identical navy blazers followed, treating him as infrastructure rather than a person. One of them muttered something about crowding the walkway. Their laughter rippled backward, joined by others who picked up the thread of mockery like a contagion spreading through the terminal. Natalie appeared carrying her medical kit, her footsteps deliberate and quiet. She'd been called about a disturbance in the terminal, dispatch had been vague, but the tone in their voice told her enough. She walked past the cluster of teenagers without acknowledgement and knelt beside Marcus's wheelchair, her movements economical and precise. The faded Special Forces insignia on his jacket caught the light. Not just any unit. Her unit. The same designation she kept sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden where no one would ever find it. She met his eyes. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need assistance?" Marcus shook his head slowly, dignity intact despite the humiliation that clung to him like smoke. "I'm okay. Just waiting for my connection." Natalie rose to her feet, and something shifted in the air around her. She turned to face the gathered crowd, the teenagers with their phones, the businessmen, the other commuters who'd stopped to watch. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but carried the weight of a command that had once moved men through minefields. This man served his country. Show some respect. The largest teenager laughed, a harsh, braying sound. "What are you gonna do, nurse lady? Give us a band-aid." Natalie's jaw tightened. Just a fractional movement, a single muscle firing. But that was all. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flush or tremble. She simply looked at him the way a surgeon might regard a particularly disappointing pathology report. The crowd's energy shifted. Something in her stillness made them understand they were closer to a line than they'd realized. Then Gerald Caldwell pushed through the crowd, his face already flushed with anger that had nothing to do with the teenagers and everything to do with Natalie's presence on his terminal floor. He grabbed her elbow, not hard enough to leave a mark, calculated that way, and pulled her aside. But he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. The volume was deliberate. The humiliation needed an audience. "Nurse Hayes, you've abandoned your post. This is not your concern. You're making a scene that disrupts station operations." She met his eyes without blinking. Someone needed to intervene. Someone needed to know their place, he shot back, his voice rising another decibel. The commuters watched like spectators at a blood sport. Marcus watched too, his face going harder than it had been even when the teenagers were mocking him. "Return to your clinic. Now." Caldwell's hand was still on her elbow, and the command in his voice was designed to make her compliance visible. To make it clear who controlled this space. Natalie pulled her arm free and walked back through the murmuring crowd. She kept her shoulders square, her stride even. The burning sensation that rose in her throat was not shame, it was something colder and more dangerous, the kind of pressure that builds behind a dam. She didn't let anyone see it. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. The next Tuesday, Caldwell called a mandatory staff meeting in the break room. Natalie sat with her hands folded. Two junior medical assistants occupied the chairs beside her, and the station's physical therapist balanced on the edge of the sink counter, looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested he'd been told to be there. Caldwell stood at the front with his arms crossed, his entire posture designed to communicate authority. The kind of authority that comes from institutional power, not from actually knowing anything. "Hayes, walk me through the protocol for treating a suspected cervical spine injury during patient transport." She began to answer, pulling the current guidelines from memory. The ones that had been standard for a decade. "No, no," Caldwell interrupted, holding up his hand like he was stopping traffic. "Use the 2003 guidelines. The ones you should have memorized in your basic training. The 2003 guidelines. The ones that had been superseded 15 years ago." Natalie opened her mouth. Closed it. The silence stretched. She could feel the junior assistants staring at their laps, their faces carefully blank. Caldwell smiled like a lawyer who'd just caught a witness in a contradiction. "Anyone else want to help our senior nurse here?" He continued for 20 minutes, cycling through deliberately obsolete procedures, his tone dripping with condescension like battery acid. "I'm concerned about your competency, Hayes. Maybe you're just not cut out for emergency response." Each word was designed to land, to stick, to make the others in the room understand that Natalie was diminishing in real time. She said nothing. That was her mistake and her strength simultaneously. That afternoon, she stepped into the service elevator heading down to medical supply storage. The doors slid shut, and that's when Caldwell stepped in behind her, blocking the entrance. As the elevator lurched downward, he pressed the stop button. The motion halted with a mechanical groan. "Let me be clear about something," he said, moving close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. His voice had dropped. That was worse than when he shouted. Lower volume meant he was comfortable with the threat. "You don't challenge me. Not in my station, not in front of passengers, not ever. You're a clinic nurse, a station rat who changes band-aids and hands out aspirin. You understand the chain of command here." Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned to take in Marja when the situation required absolute clarity. When one wrong word would echo across a battlefield. "I understand exactly what kind of man you are," she said quietly. He released the stop button, smirking as the elevator descended. The triumph on his face was premature. He had no idea what he'd just done. That evening, when Natalie returned to her locker, she found the word scrawled across it in thick permanent marker, "Station Rat." The letters were crude but deliberate. Someone had taken time with this. Her hand trembled as she traced the letters, and she let it. This moment was private. One tear escaped, tracking down her cheek before she wiped it away without breaking her stare at the graffiti. In this moment, she could be angry. In this moment, she was alone. She turned to leave and found Caldwell watching from the staff room doorway, arms folded, eyebrow raised. He'd orchestrated this too, that much was obvious. The satisfaction on his face confirmed it. She walked directly toward him, closing the distance between them with a kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her voice, when she spoke, was so quiet that only he could hear it. "I've treated men with more honor in their dying breath than you've shown in your entire career." His smirk faltered for just a second, the briefest crack in his certainty. But that was all she needed. The armor of false authority was wearing thin, and they both knew it. He recovered quickly. "Big words from a small person, Hayes." She walked past him without responding. But that wasn't the end of it. That was never the end of it. That was just Caldwell escalating toward something he didn't have the rank or the training to understand. 2 weeks passed. Caldwell reassigned one of Natalie's medical assistants to janitorial duty. Changed her schedule to overnight shifts, then back to mornings without notice, small, calculated disruptions designed to isolate her. She showed up on time regardless, saying nothing. She filled out incident reports when equipment went missing. She documented the schedule changes. She kept records the way someone keeps evidence, meticulous and precise. But that wasn't the worst part. On a Thursday afternoon at 4:17, the crowd in the main terminal surged as a businessman in his 50s suddenly clutched his chest near the coffee kiosk. His briefcase fell, scattering papers across the tile like snow. He went down hard, his body folding onto itself. Commuters scattered. Someone screamed for a doctor. Natalie was there in seconds, her medical kit already open before her knees hit the ground. The staff meeting room was smaller than it needed to be, intentionally so. Caldwell sat at the head of the table with 3 junior nurses arranged like an audience, their notepads blank and ready. Natalie stood because there were no empty chairs, a deliberate detail. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and she could smell the stale coffee from the break room down the hall. "Let's discuss your medical knowledge, shall we?" Caldwell opened a thick binder. His voice was silk over steel. Question 1. A patient presents with chest pain radiating to the left arm, diaphoresis, and shortness of breath. What's your differential diagnosis? Natalie answered correctly. MI, aortic dissection, pulmonary embolism, pneumonia, acute pericarditis. Incomplete, he said flatly. You missed esophageal rupture. A nurse with proper training would have considered that immediately. He made a note. The junior staff shifted. One of them was a girl Natalie had trained 2 months ago on proper for insertion technique. The girl wouldn't meet her eyes. Question 2. Explain the mechanism of action for digoxin in atrial fibrillation management. She explained it. He shot back, that's outdated protocol. We discontinued digoxin monitoring here in 2019. You should know that. Another note. Another small knife. 5 more questions followed. Each one was designed to trap her. When she answered correctly, he moved the goalpost. When she hesitated, even for a second, he pounced. Hesitation kills patients, Nurse Hayes. One of the junior nurses looked down at her coffee cup like it held the secrets of the universe. 20 minutes. That's how long it took him to systematically dismantle her credibility in front of staff who depended on her judgment during emergencies. The room went so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall, 2:41 p.m., the exact moment her professional authority became something negotiable in the minds of people who worked beside her. When he finally dismissed her, she stood and walked out without a word. That was her mistake, though she didn't know it yet. Any acknowledgement, anger, tears, defensiveness, would have been human. Her silence made her seem guilty. 3 days later, Caldwell found her restocking the clinic supply cabinet. The service elevator was empty when she stepped inside at 6:15 a.m., before the station terminals filled with commuters. He was already waiting. His arm shot out, blocking the doors from closing. The movement was deliberate, calculated. He wasn't attacking. He was cornering. We need to talk about chain of command, he said. His cologne smelled like expensive aftershave and something else underneath, something like wet concrete after rain. I have clinic prep, Natalie said quietly. No. You don't. His arm stayed across the door. You made a scene with that veteran. Do you understand what you did? You disrupted station operations. You made a statement that contradicted my authority in front of commuters. Station management exists for a reason, Hayes. There's a structure. You're at the bottom of it. She watched him. Not his face, she learned long ago that faces lie. She watched his chest rise and fall, watched the small muscle twitch at his jaw when he spoke the word bottom. This was about power, the kind that only mattered to people who'd never held real power. I understand, she said. Do you? He stepped closer. The elevator was cold. Because from where I'm standing, you seem to think you can make decisions that affect this entire facility based on your personal feelings. That's not how this works. You follow protocol. You defer to management. You don't know your place, and that makes you dangerous. He dropped his arm. The door slid shut as he left, trapping her in the elevator for another 4 seconds before it resumed its descent. When it opened at the ground level, she stepped out into the station terminal. The morning crowd was already moving, business people with roller bags, families heading to connections, the rhythm of Norfolk's trains pulling in and out like a mechanical heartbeat. She made it through the day without speaking to anyone. That evening, when she opened her locker in the break room, the words were impossible to miss. Black permanent marker, thick and aggressive, station rat. The letters were large enough that anyone walking past would see them. The message was for everyone, not just her. She stared at it for 30 seconds. Her jaw clenched once, then released. She pulled out a bottle of rubbing alcohol and paper towels from the supply cabinet and began wiping the locker clean. The marker was fresh enough that it came off in smudges, leaving a faint grey ghost of the letters behind. She could scrub it clean, but the image would stay in the break room, the locker with the insult that wouldn't fully disappear. Someone had seen her clean it. She heard footsteps pause behind her, then continue. By morning, Everyone would know. That was the point. The schedule changes started the next week. Her rotation had been stable for 3 years, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., Monday through Friday, with weekends off. That Wednesday, a new schedule was posted. Overnight shift. Friday through Monday 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. No notice. No discussion. She found out when she arrived at 6 a.m. Thursday and found her name listed as reassigned on the clipboard. She didn't argue. She adjusted her sleep cycle and showed up Friday at 9:45 p.m., 15 minutes early, like she always did. Monday morning, the schedule changed again. Back to 6 a.m. Then the following week, split shifts. 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., then 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., with no break between. The instability was intentional. Her mind would never adjust. Her body would stay in a state of low-level exhaustion. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the isolation. Her medical assistant, Teresa, who had worked with her for 18 months, was reassigned to janitorial duty. Restructuring, Caldwell said in a memo. Station efficiency improvements. Teresa's face had gone pale when Natalie saw her in the hallway with a mop and bucket. She mouthed "I'm sorry" before hurrying away. The remaining clinic staff, a part-time receptionist and one LPN, began eating lunch away from the break room when Natalie was there. When she asked for help restocking inventory or needed an extra set of hands during a busy afternoon, they suddenly had tasks elsewhere. Nothing was said. Nothing had to be said. The message was clear: associating with Natalie Hayes was professionally dangerous. By the following Tuesday, Caldwell had gone further. A memo appeared in her locker, printed on official transit authority letterhead. Clinic access is now restricted to 6:33 a.m. to 2:53 p.m., Monday through Friday. All other personnel must be accompanied by management approval to enter the clinic during off hours. Effective immediately. She read it once, folded it, and put it in her jacket pocket. That same afternoon, she tried to check on Mr. Chen, a regular patient with diabetes management issues who'd come in complaining of dizziness. She'd ordered some basic labs. When the results came back, she wanted to review them with the LPN before making a follow-up call to his home. The LPN glanced at the chart, then at Caldwell, who was watching from his office across the terminal, and said, "I need to run the registers. You'll have to handle that one solo." Natalie said nothing. She made the call herself, relayed the results to Mr. Chen, adjusted his medication recommendations. The work got done. It always got done. But the message was unmistakable: she was being systematically cut off, isolated, pushed toward the exit. 3 days passed like that. She worked her shifted hours, saw her patients, documented everything with meticulous precision, and watched her professional reputation dissolve in increments so small that no single moment seemed catastrophic. It was like watching a building's foundation crack, hairline fissures that no one else noticed until the whole structure started to lean. Her jacket pocket grew heavy with the weight of that faded unit patch. She could feel it through the fabric when she moved, a small reminder of who she'd been. The patch was from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 12 years ago, before Norfolk, before the train station, before everything became about being invisible. She had made it home from Marja with pieces of her soul still scattered across that dust, and she'd chosen invisibility because it seemed safer than the alternative. But safety was a luxury, she was learning. Safety required someone else to decide you were worth protecting. On Friday morning, walking into the station for her 6 a.m. shift, Natalie Hayes passed Gerald Caldwell at the ticket counter. He was on his phone, pacing, his free hand gesturing at nothing. He didn't see her. Or he did, and chose not to acknowledge her. The distinction didn't matter anymore. She clocked in. She put on her scrubs. She washed her hands and stepped into the clinic, ready for whatever the day would bring, patients who trusted her, a schedule designed to break her rhythm, a building that no longer wanted her there. The patch against her ribs felt like a heartbeat. The fluorescent lights of the Norfolk Train Station main terminal buzzed with their usual afternoon chaos. Commuters rushed between platforms. A mother chased a toddler near the ticket booths. The vending machines hummed their mechanical songs. Natalie moved through it all like a ghost in scrubs, restocking the clinic supply cart, keeping her head down, her movements economical and purposeful. 2 weeks had passed since the locker vandalism. 2 weeks of altered schedules, reassigned staff, systematic isolation. 2 weeks of Caldwell's quiet institutional pressure, each day designed to wear her thinner. She was checking the defibrillator pads, expired 3 months ago, a failure that should have been caught by whoever replaced her assistant, when the sound changed. The ambient noise shifted. Screams cut through the terminal's baseline hum like a knife. A man in his 60s, wearing a grey business suit, had collapsed near the central information desk. His face was the color of old concrete. He gasped, clutching his left arm, his chest heaving in the specific rhythm of catastrophic failure. The people around him moved in that panic dance, some stepping back, some filming on their phones, one older woman calling 911 while others simply froze, as if myocardial infarction was a contagious condition they could avoid by proximity avoidance. Natalie was moving before her brain caught up with her body. She knew that sound. She knew that grey face. She knew that rhythm because she'd heard it in bombed-out clinics and medevac helicopters and on operating tables that weren't tables at all but stretchers on dirt floors. 15 minutes. That's what dispatch would say when the ambulance arrived. Traffic on Highway 17 was gridlocked. The paramedics were stuck somewhere on the north side of the city, and this man had maybe 8 minutes before his myocardium stopped delivering oxygen to tissue that couldn't survive without it. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already moving to check his carotid pulse. Thready. Barely there. His breathing was shallow, desperate, the kind of breathing that came from a body in final negotiation with the laws of physics. His eyes found hers and something in them broke, the recognition that this was not going to end well, that the universe had decided to stop cooperating. ETA on the ambulance, she asked the woman with the phone, her voice level, clinical. They said 15 minutes. Traffic is. Natalie wasn't listening anymore. She was already moving, already deciding. Her hands found the clinic supply bag she kept in the terminal booth, the same bag she'd carried for 3 years, maintained with meticulous discipline, never expecting to use what it contained. Inside, wrapped in sterile cloth and sealed in a metal case no larger than a paperback book, was her pocket surgical kit. Scalpel, forceps, hemostats, sutures, a syringe of saline. Instruments she'd last used in a structure that used to be a school in Marja, Afghanistan, while mortar fire punched holes through the walls around her. 20 years of keeping those instruments pristine. 20 years of muscle memory she'd been trying to bury as deep as the military records that said she didn't exist. She opened the case. Her hands were steady. The shaking, the trembling that should have come, never did. Her hands looked like other hands, scarred with old burns and surgical marks, but they moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, which was true, which was why she could never be just a nurse, which was why Caldwell was right to be afraid of her, even if he didn't understand what he was afraid of. The man was already losing consciousness. His breathing had that rattling quality, that gurgling in the throat that meant fluid in the lungs, meant the failure was cascading into total system collapse. She looked at the crowd around them, 30, 40 people now, phones raised like weapons, recording. She looked at the station clock. 2:11 p.m. She looked at the man's chest and made her decision in the same way she'd made decisions in Marja, not by weighing options, but by recognizing that there was only one choice that meant anything. She tore open his shirt. The buttons scattered across the terminal floor like teeth. She felt for the landmarks on his chest, the second intercostal space, the line between his ribs. The scalpel was already in her hand, already moving. The incision was clean, precise, the blade meeting resistance and then surrendering to her will. Blood welled up immediately, thick and dark, spilling across his pale chest in rivers that caught the fluorescent light. Pain is data. Pain is information. She'd been taught that once, in a briefing room at a place she couldn't legally acknowledge. The man's body convulsed, a response to stimulus, not consciousness. His nervous system was still firing, even though his will had already begun its retreat. She opened the thoracic cavity with the methodical precision of someone who understood that hesitation killed people. Her hands found his heart, massive, enlarged, in fibrillation, trying to beat but achieving only the tremor of total failure. 30 seconds. That's all it took. She began manual cardiac massage, her hands moving with the terrible intimacy of someone performing open-heart surgery on a concrete floor while 700 people watched on their phones, while the terminal's ambient noise transformed into something that wasn't noise at all but silence, absolute, perfect, the silence of a world that had stopped believing such things were possible. He's been down how long? She asked nobody in particular. Maybe 2 minutes, someone whispered back. 2 minutes. 8 minutes total until cardiac arrest becomes brain death, becomes the permanent kind of gone. The paramedics were still 11 minutes away if traffic had moved at all, which it hadn't. The man's ribs shifted under her palms, a resistance that meant she was compressing his heart directly, that her hands were doing the work his organ had abandoned. Blood coated her forearms, warm and slick, soaking into her scrubs, marking her as something other than what she'd been pretending to be. Her vision had narrowed. The crowd, the phones, the fluorescent lights, the shocked faces, all of it fell away into peripheral space. There was only the rhythm. Pump. Pause. Pump. Pause. The artificial beat she was imposing on his shattered anatomy, the bridge between the dead moment and the moment that might still contain life. 5 minutes. The man's pupils began to dilate. Bad sign. The brain was already calculating its exit strategy. She increased the pressure, feeling his ribs flex under her palms like they were alive things with their own agenda. She should have stopped. Protocol would have said stop. Caldwell would have appeared on the terminal floor in 30 seconds to order her to stop, to tell her she was performing unauthorized medical procedures, to threaten her with everything he had left. But Caldwell wasn't there, and protocol belonged to people who'd never felt a human heart stop beating in their hands. 7 minutes. She heard the sirens before she felt them, that wail cutting through the terminal like a statement of emergency so pure it transcended language. Wheels on tile. Shouting. Paramedics moving with controlled urgency, one of them immediately moving to her hands, shouting questions she didn't hear. What have you got? A male voice. Urgent. Acute MI, went down 7 minutes ago, no pulse, I've been manually compressing. She was already stepping back, already passing the work to hands that had a defibrillator and medications and all the institutional authority she'd been stripped of. The paramedic looked down at the man's open chest, at the blood, at the crude but effective incision, and something shifted in his face. Recognition. The understanding that this wasn't a civilian who'd done this. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Who did this? He asked. She was already walking away. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline beginning its chemical retreat, from the body's delayed response to 6 minutes of total focus, from the realization that she'd just broken every protocol that had kept her invisible. She could hear them loading him, could hear the sharp efficient chatter of paramedics doing their job, could hear the senior medic radioing ahead, we've got a 30-minute transport, likely DOA on intake, but someone performed emergency thoracotomy at scene, might extend window. The man survived. She didn't know it yet, wouldn't know it for 3 days, but when she finally saw it, a news alert on her phone while sitting in a waiting room that smelled like other people's despair, the article would mention that the field procedure had been the only reason he'd made it to surgery alive, that the surgical team at Oak Creek Memorial had managed to repair the aortic dissection only because someone with field medicine expertise had kept his brain alive long enough for him to get there. The article would not mention who had done it. Caldwell would make sure of that. 3 days passed like water through a strainer, time that seemed to move in both directions at once, minutes that lasted hours, hours that vanished in the space between blinks. Natalie sat in the Norfolk VA hospital waiting room, surrounded by wounded men and women in various states of being broken. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that specific hum that seemed to burrow into the base of her skull, that sound that meant institutional spaces, meant waiting, meant that the important parts of your story were being decided in rooms where you didn't get to speak. A young Marine across from her, couldn't have been more than 25, couldn't have been in country for more than one tour, bounced his knee in that rhythm that meant his nervous system was still running combat protocols, still waiting for the next mortar strike, still unable to convince his body that the war had ended. She knew that rhythm. She'd taught other people to recognize it, back when she had authority, back when she was a major, back when she existed in a way that forms and records could verify. The older man with the Vietnam veteran's cap read a magazine he wasn't actually looking at, his jaw tight enough to break teeth. She used to treat men like him. Special Forces medics who'd spent 40 years trying to forget what their hands had been trained to do, what they'd done, how it had felt, whether the people they'd saved were still alive or whether the killing had just been delayed by a few years, a few decades, until the PTSD or the alcohol or the simple mathematical certainty of mortality caught up with them. She'd been one of them. She was one of them. The transition from being a doctor who saved people to being a patient who needed saving was shorter than anyone admitted. Inside her jacket lining, her fingers found the patch. Faded olive drab, embroidered with the insignia of a unit that officially didn't exist anymore, a unit that had operated in places that didn't appear on maps, in operations that would never have official names. The stitching was coming loose on one edge. She'd sewn it herself, 20 years ago, the night before she was ordered to disappear. It was the only physical proof that Major Natalie Hayes had ever existed, that she'd been more than a ghost in scrubs, that she'd mattered to something larger than the small institutional world of a train station clinic. The receptionist called her name, the civilian name, the one on the paperwork, the one that wasn't on any military roster anymore. She stood. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. The man from the terminal had survived surgery. The article was carefully worded, non-committal about who'd performed the initial intervention, but the meaning was clear: someone had saved him, and that someone had been willing to break every rule to do it. She should have felt something. Relief, maybe. The satisfaction of knowing the field thoracotomy had bought him the hours he needed. But instead, there was only the same numbness that had accompanied her for 2 decades, the anesthetic the military had prescribed when they made her disappear. The nightmares were worse than the emptiness. The nightmares, at least, were proof that she'd been alive once, that the things she'd seen and done had actually happened, that she wasn't just a construct, a procedure manual in human form. She took a seat in the intake office and waited for someone to help her remember how to exist as a person again. The call came through at 4:24 p.m. on a Tuesday, 43 minutes after the last commuter had witnessed Natalie perform emergency thoracotomy on a stranger's chest in the main terminal of Norfolk Train Station. Gerald Caldwell sat in his office on the 3rd floor, watching the security footage on a loop, her hands moving with precision that didn't match the timid nurse he'd spent 2 weeks systematically destroying. He watched her crack the man's sternum. He watched her reach inside. He watched the crowd filming on their phones. And then he picked up the phone and called his contact at the Transit Authority's regional office, a man named Daniels who owed him favors from 3 different county board meetings. "We have a liability nightmare," Caldwell said, his voice steady, controlled, the voice of a man managing a crisis. "Civilian employee performing surgery without proper credentials. I've already documented her overstepping her authority on multiple occasions. This is what happens when you don't maintain chain of command." He paused, letting the silence carry weight. "I suspended her on grounds pending investigation. But we need to move fast before the media gets hold of this." What Caldwell didn't know was that the media had already gotten hold of it. 17 different video angles. 14 eyewitnesses. A man named Robert Chen, whose heart Natalie had brought back from flatline on that terminal floor, who was already in Oak Creek Memorial's cardiac unit being prepped for surgery, whose wife was talking to reporters in the waiting room about how the clinic nurse had saved her husband's life with a technique that shouldn't have existed outside a battlefield. By Wednesday morning, the decision came down from above Caldwell's pay grade. Administrative leave, pending investigation. Building access revoked. The clinic's remaining 2 nurses were reassigned to other stations. Every file on Natalie's terminal was flagged for audit. Caldwell made sure of it personally, typing the restriction codes himself, his hands moving with the satisfaction of a man watching dominoes fall exactly as he'd arranged them. Then came the media statement. Caldwell had written it himself, working with the Transit Authority's communications director, a carefully worded piece that suggested Natalie had acted beyond the scope of civilian nursing credentials, that she had endangered public safety through unauthorized medical procedures, that the station management took patient protection and regulatory compliance very seriously. He positioned himself as the voice of institutional responsibility, the administrator who'd been alert enough to document her concerning pattern of behavior before something catastrophic happened. It was masterful. It was competent. It was catastrophic. The footage went viral within 18 hours. 14 million views. News outlets across the country picked it up, not because a woman had performed emergency surgery, but because the framing was wrong. Because the narrative smelled like cover-up. Because someone had clearly moved very quickly to discredit a hero. By Thursday morning, the tweet had crystallized into a single phrase: they tried to bury her. Hashtags. Think pieces. A former Army medic doing commentary on MSNBC about the exact technique Natalie had used, confirming it was a legitimate field procedure that saved lives in Kandahar and Fallujah and Sanjin. The Norfolk Ledger pulled her clinic employment file. 1 page in, they found a notation from 3 years ago, observed demonstrating advanced trauma protocol knowledge. Unusual for civilian nurse position. Further investigation recommended. The recommendation had been filed away and forgotten. Until it wasn't. 1 week after the emergency procedure, Marcus Webb returned to the clinic. Not for medical care, his prosthetic was holding fine. He came because a journalist named Sarah Chen, the wife of the man Natalie had saved, had called him as part of a human interest story about veteran services in the station. Sarah was filming, conducting interviews, trying to document how a train station full of thousands of people had witnessed heroism and then watched the hero get silenced. Marcus sat in front of her camera and the words came out steady, the way they did when a man was speaking the absolute truth. "That's Major Hayes," he said, looking directly into the lens. "She saved my life in Marja when I was 8 years old. I was bleeding out from an IED strike. She was operating under fire for 36 hours straight. She's the reason I'm breathing. She's the reason I'm here." He paused. "And they called her unqualified." That's when the station nurse on duty, a younger woman named Keisha who'd been too afraid to help Natalie during the Caldwell campaign, walked to the personnel filing system with trembling hands. The file labeled Hayes, Natalie was thin, almost empty. Just routine hire paperwork. But clipped to the back, in a manila envelope marked with a red security stripe, was something else. She opened it. Her hands shook as she read. The words on that page were in military format, terse and official: Major Natalie Claire Hayes, United States Army Special Forces Command, Medical Officer. Bronze Star with Valor. 2 silver stars. Purple Heart. MIA status rescinded per National Security Directive 5847X, records classified. Clearance required for further access. The room went silent. So quiet you could hear the ventilator in the background of Sarah Chen's still rolling camera. Within 2 hours, a man arrived at the station. Former SEAL Team 3, call sign Breaker, now working as a consultant for a military museum in Washington. He'd seen the viral video. He'd heard Marcus's name. He walked into that station and asked to speak to the journalist, and what happened next was captured on every camera in the building. "Major Natalie Hayes served with me in 2011, he said, standing in the main terminal where Natalie had performed the thoracotomy. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. That means she did something exceptional in direct combat. Silver Star, not 1, 2, it means she risked her life to save other service members. Purple Heart means she was wounded doing it. She performed field surgery under direct fire for 72 hours straight and saved 14 operatives. That includes 3 children we extracted from a compound. She's a decorated officer. Not a fraud. Not unqualified. A decorated officer." The reporter turned her camera toward the camera itself. This was going live. Sarah Chen's phone was already buzzing with calls from news desks across the country. She held up her hand to Breaker and dialed her newsroom. We need to go live in 5 minutes. We have seal verification of everything. We have military records. That evening, at 6:13 p.m., Gerald Caldwell was sitting in his apartment watching the news broadcast. He saw himself, footage of his statement, his careful wording about civilian qualifications and regulatory concerns. Then he saw Breaker, in dress uniform, naming decorations that didn't exist in any public record. Then he saw a graphic appear on screen, Major Natalie Hayes, USACOM Medical, Classified Operations, 2009 to 2013. The anchor was reading from a letter. A statement from the Department of Defense. The words were clinical and devastating. Major Natalie Claire Hayes is a decorated officer whose service record remains partially classified due to the sensitive nature of ongoing operations. Her professional qualifications have been verified at the highest level. Any public statements suggesting her actions were unauthorized or reckless are demonstrably false. Caldwell's phone started ringing. By 7:15 p.m., the Transit Authority's legal team was in emergency session. By 8:44 p.m., they'd called him directly. Don't speak to anyone. Don't go to work tomorrow. We need to consult with our attorneys about your liability in this situation. At 8:23 p.m., during the live broadcast that 14 million people were still watching, a call came through. The anchor held her earpiece, listened, and then looked directly at the camera. We're getting word that a defense intelligence official is calling in. Let me take this live. The voice on the phone was calm, measured, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. This is Deputy Director William Mercer, Defense Intelligence Agency. I want to be clear on the record, Major Natalie Hayes was involved in classified operations that saved approximately 470 lives. She is a legitimate decorated officer. And I want to address Mr. Caldwell's earlier statement about her competence. They constitute defamation of a military officer. Additionally, during our background verification, we discovered that Mr. Caldwell was dishonorably discharged from the Coast Guard in 1998 for fraudulent enlistment and falsifying service records. He has no military background whatsoever. He has no qualifications to assess anyone's credentials. And his actions appear to constitute harassment of a federal officer. The broadcast went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then the phone started ringing. Every phone in every newsroom in the country. By Friday morning, the story had pivoted completely. Decorated Special Forces officer forced into hiding. Suspended for saving a life using the exact skills her country taught her. Meanwhile, the administrator who tried to bury her, no military service, false credentials, a pattern of employment fraud at 3 previous institutions. The Norfolk Ledger's investigation went live Saturday morning, 3 jobs, 3 sets of inflated credentials. Pictures of Caldwell in a Coast Guard dress uniform, a uniform he'd never earned, circulating on every platform. His ex-wife appeared on a morning talk show with photographs. He told me he was a rescue swimmer. I wore a military spouse pin to my book club. I had no idea it was all lies. By Sunday, the Transit Authority held an emergency board meeting. By Monday, they issued their statement, Station Manager Gerald Caldwell has been terminated for cause. His credentials are revoked. The investigation into Nurse Hayes is suspended pending full review. The tone was not regretful. It was protective of themselves. Caldwell's phone had stopped ringing by Tuesday. It wasn't because people were done calling. It was because he'd stopped answering. His wife had filed for divorce. His condo was issuing an eviction notice. 3 job applications went unanswered. The lawsuits were piling up, from Robert Chen for defamation, from Marcus Webb for emotional distress, from the public mocking that Caldwell had allowed to continue, from the Transit Authority itself for putting them in this position. 6 months later, he sat at a folding table near the bathrooms of Norfolk Train Station, insurance brochures spread before him like the last cards in a hand he'd already lost. The polo shirt with the company logo was too big now. His savings account had been decimated. The only job offer he'd gotten was this, supplemental insurance sales, commission only, no base salary, no benefits, assigned location at Norfolk Train Station, main terminal. the exact place where his authority had collapsed. Natalie Hayes walked past his table on her way to the platform, her hand resting on Marcus Webb's shoulder. She'd been reinstated. Offered a promotion to regional medical director that she'd politely declined. The faded unit patch, her unit patch, the one she'd sewn into her jacket lining 20 years ago, now hung framed on the clinic wall behind her desk. Finally visible. Finally real. Caldwell's eyes fixed on the floor as they passed. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. He simply watched his brochures and waited for someone who would never come back. On the train, Marcus asked her the question he'd been holding on to. You ever regret it? The hiding? Natalie touched the empty space on her jacket where the patch had been. No, she said quietly. The hiding wasn't my choice. But staying was. And I'd do it again to help someone like you. 3 days later, at the Pentagon, a 4-star general pinned her medals to her chest while cameras flashed and her name was finally, officially, no longer classified. Bronze Star with Valor. Silver Star. Silver Star again. Purple Heart. Each one read aloud. Each one proof that she had existed all along, that the quietest person in the room might just be holding it all together. Hit like and subscribe if you're enjoying this. And I'm always curious, drop a comment and tell us if you're watching from a big city or a small town. Now let's continue the story.